Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a really fascinating, highly structured philosophy from an author named Su Feng. We're going to be exploring what he calls the soul garden. And, according to Su Feng, this isn't just some nice poetic idea. It is literally the definitive blueprint for human civilization and for your own individual destiny. So let's just jump right in and see how this framework attempts to explain the state of our world today. The text actually hooks us right out of the gate with this really tangible architectural metaphor. It says, the height of a building is related to its foundation. If the foundation is quicksand, even a small cottage will collapse at any time. Now, what's so cool about this is how it takes these massive, abstract spiritual concepts and grounds them. I mean, think about it. If you're building a skyscraper, you absolutely need solid bedrock, right? Su Feng uses that basic physical truth to make a really profound point about our inner psychology.
Okay, let's move into section 1, the foundation of life, where we're going to look at things on the micro level, focusing on the individual.
So first things first, what exactly does Shefeng mean by a soul garden? Well, the text defines it as the foundational core of a person that dictates the ultimate life and destiny that person achieves. Think of it kind of like the psychological and spiritual soil from which literally every thought, action, and outcome in your life grows out of. It is the absolute bedrock of everything you become. And man, this next part really illustrates the extreme stakes we're dealing with here. The author doesn't leave much wiggle room. On one hand, cultivating a perfect soul garden leads to the ultimate spiritual elevation, becoming a celestial being or a Buddha. But on the flip side, having an ugly soul garden means you become a literal ghost or a demon. It's a pretty stark contrast, and it heavily emphasizes how this internal foundation dictates your entire trajectory. All right, let's zoom out a bit for section 2, the measure of civilization. Let's see how this text evaluates entire nations. Now, Su Feng makes a really bold claim here. He argues that whether a country is truly civilized depends entirely on whether the soul gardens of its citizens are perfect or not. This is a massive departure from how we usually measure civilization, right? We're so used to looking at GDP or technological advancement or fancy infrastructure. But the source material insists that, hey, if the people's inner foundations are flawed, that nation is simply not civilized, period. Because of that perspective, the author lays out this incredibly strict two-step prerequisite for any society. Step 1, you have to perfect and refine the soul gardens of the citizens. Only after that can you move to step 2, which is bringing the country into the actual ranks of civilization. So true societal progress, according to this framework, is exclusively an inside-out job. You literally cannot build a civilized society on top of an uncivilized inner foundation. Which brings us to section 3, the cost of imperfection. We're going to look at systemic failures. It really forces us to ask this pivotal question. What actually are the consequences of an imperfect soul garden? Well, according to Su Feng, it's not just about personal unhappiness. These flaws manifest as cascading systemic failures across basically every level of society. Let's look at how he says this plays out in the real world across different professions. The text systematically links a flawed inner foundation straight to corruption. An official with an imperfect soul, they corrupt, take bribes, and oppress the people. A businessman will cheat and deceive purely for profit, and civil servants end up fawning over their superiors while making life incredibly difficult for honest, everyday people. And it doesn't stop there. This breakdown reaches the very highest levels of power and trust. The text claims a president will oppress dissenters and treat people as nothing just to consolidate power. An entrepreneur will exploit workers and pump out substandard products. Even a doctor, someone whose literal job is to heal, will overtreat minor illnesses simply to empty a patient's wallet. The source points out that this rot goes all the way down to our physical safety and even the food on our plates. A police officer might use their power to bully kind-hearted people. A farmer might knowingly produce toxic agricultural products, and merchants might sell toxic food, drinks, and medicines. It essentially paints a picture of a society where trust completely evaporates, all because the individuals within it lack a solid moral and spiritual core. So basically, when you combine an imperfect soul with power, the results are pretty devastating. The text states that power without a perfected soul completely inverts right and wrong. It creates numerous wrongful convictions, it makes people terrified to speak the truth, and ultimately forces entire populations to live in fear and panic, totally devoid of peace. It's a really stark warning about what happens when internal flaws meet external authority. Let's transition into section 4, the root of human crisis. The text makes it incredibly clear that this damage isn't just institutional, it's deeply emotional and it's constant. People with imperfect soul gardens don't just act unethically, they constantly create troubles, anxiety, contradictions, conflicts, disappointment, and despair. Just imagine that compounding emotional toll on the world on any given Tuesday. It's portrayed as an environment of perpetual, inescapable friction.
So you gotta wonder, what actually brings about the crisis of humanity? When we look at all the massive, overwhelming problems facing the world today, where do they truly originate?
And here is the core thesis of the entire text. The crisis of humanity is never brought about by nature, but by the imperfect souls of people. Su Feng argues that the absolute greatest crisis we face isn't environmental, it's not economic, and it isn't external at all. It is fundamentally a crisis of the soul. All the external chaos we see, that's merely a symptom of our own internal decay.
Which leads us to our final part, Section 5, Cultivating Your Soul Garden.
On a deeply personal level, the stakes really couldn't be higher. Cultivating your garden is presented as the singular path to living a happy life and reaching the other shore, which the author equates to heaven. On the other hand, neglecting your garden means you should never even expect to live a happy life. The text is completely uncompromising here. Happiness and spiritual salvation aren't accidents. They require active, intentional cultivation. And zooming out to the extreme geopolitical stakes, the author outlines two paths. If a nation prioritizes the construction of its citizens' souls, it achieves a truly civilized society. But if a nation ignores this inner construction, it will inevitably descend into barbarism, ignorance, tyranny, and misery. So the very survival of a nation is seen as directly tied to the spiritual maintenance of its people.
All of this brings us right back full circle to where we started. Based on this text, we really have to ask ourselves, is the foundation of your life built on solid ground, or are you building on quicksand? It's a profound, challenging question that asks us to look inward before we go trying to fix the world around us. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this deep dive into the soul garden gives you plenty to think about.